It's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Stuart Taylor. Stuart is Publishing Director of the Royal Society, and he's going to be dealing with some of the themes that came out of the conference that the Society held to celebrate the 350th birthday of the Learned Journal. He has a DPhil in psychopharmacology from Oxford, and prior to that worked at Blackwell's. Stuart.
Wow, what a hard act to follow. Well, that's a great talk. I don't have any slides, so you're just going to have to look at me, I'm afraid. So my brief today was to talk about the changing landscape for science journals and how the field of scholarly communication might evolve in the future, based on a 4-day meeting I organised at the Royal Society last spring. So I'll start with a few words about the Royal Society and our publishing, and then describe last year's meeting and conclude with the key issues to emerge and the changes we've made as a result. But before I do so, I should say that the Royal Society has no uniquely privileged knowledge or expertise in this area, and all the things that were discussed at the meeting have been and still are being widely discussed elsewhere. So there'll be no earth-shattering revelations, I'm afraid. It's also important to point out that our event was intended to be a forum for discussion and debate around the issues amongst the main stakeholders in the process. It was expressly not designed as a Royal Society policy project which would deliver a neatly packaged set of recommendations at the end. I'm also acutely aware that I'm speaking to a room full of publishers, whereas what I'm about to say takes a rather wider view of scholarly communication, because obviously the Royal Society wears a number of carries a number of stakeholder roles in this space, as a funder, as a learned society, as a science policy organisation, and as a publisher. So, having lowered your expectations to an appropriate level, I'll begin. The Royal Society is the UK's National Academy of Science, rather like the NAS is for the United States or the Leopoldina is for Germany. We were founded in 1660 by a group of Enlightenment scholars, not yet called scientists, with the fundamental purpose of promoting natural knowledge for the benefit of humanity. Today, the Society works in a number of areas, which include providing science policy advice to government, funding science, recognising outstanding scientific achievement, fostering international scientific cooperation, public engagement and science education. We're an independent organisation. We derive most of our funding from government in the form of a grant, but we also raise money from donors and we generate funds from our 2 trading arms. One of those trading arms is journal publishing, which is how I've got my invitation here today. As we've just heard, in 1665, just a few years after we received our royal charter and a rather nice silver gilt mace from King Charles II, we launched the world's first science journal, Philosophical Transactions. Back then, our publishing was scarcely profitable, and it remained that way for a very long time. It's only really since World War II that we've regularly made a surplus on our publishing. Today, we publish 10 peer-reviewed journals and make a healthy return on £6.5 million worth of turnover, and the journals cover the whole range of science and mathematics, although we're quite a lot stronger in biological sciences than in the physical sciences. In 2006, we introduced an open access option for all our existing subscription journals, around the same time, of course, as most other publishers did. And in 2010, we launched our first fully open access journal, Open Biology, followed by a second in 2014, Royal Society Open Science. Last year, we held a programme of events to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the world's first science journal. And one of these events was entitled The Future of Scholarly Scientific Communication. It was a series of discussions held over 4 days to look at the evolving and controversial areas in scholarly communication, looking at the impact of technology, the culture of science, and trying to look at how scientists might communicate in the future. The main areas of discussion were peer review, reproducibility, ethics and misconduct, business models, measurement of impact and the reward system, and future mechanisms for scholarly communication. We used our convening power to bring together a selected group of experts representing all the key stakeholders in the space, so researchers, learned societies, funders, librarians, science communicators, policymakers, journalists and industry. The group was kept deliberately small as we wanted to make the event as interactive as possible and to make sure that all participants shared their views, questioned assumptions, and offered innovative ideas. Some of the participants are in this room, so I'm sure they'll pipe up if I get anything wrong. Each session started with a few short provocation talks with the intention of getting discussion moving and getting people thinking, but we emphasized the discussion element of the meeting. So I'll now summarize the key areas of things we discussed. The first session on peer review was held in collaboration with the Wellcome Trust and addressed the following questions. What is peer review for? How well is it doing? How might it do it better? And what might replace it? To start, we had a spirited and entertaining debate on the motion, peer review is fit for purpose. Supporting was Professor Georgina Mace of Imperial College London and herself an experienced journal editor, who said that pre-publication peer review has the functions of evaluating findings for testability, reproducibility, and interpretability prior to publication. Given the impact on a researcher's career, it's obviously important that it be done fairly. It's served science well over a long period of time, and while it's not perfect, it's not broken either. It uses checks and balances to provide quality assurance, helps authors to improve their papers, and journals in turn develop a level of prestige based on how well they do peer review. Unfortunately, the system's now under great pressure due to the prodigious growth in volume, and as we know, it doesn't always follow this ideal. There's also quite a diversity in terms of the actual detailed practice of peer review at various journals. And there are very obviously challenges with interdisciplinary papers that we know about. Professor Mace also pointed out that if we abandoned pre-publication peer review altogether, we'd presumably be left with some form of post-publication peer review. But might this not lead to problems, given that much work is partially or even completely flawed? It would then be able to get out and disseminate and cause problems before its faults could be identified. Furthermore, we'd lose the important filtering function of peer review in bringing the most important papers to the attention of readers. It's true that journals may have wrongly rejected some major discoveries in the past, but hasn't peer review allowed us to create the pyramid of findings on which science is based? After all, the blogosphere is not yet where most people go for their authoritative information. Rejecting the motion was Dr. Richard Smith, ex-editor of the BMJ, who gave a characteristically spirited performance. He said that peer review is faith-based, not evidence-based. It's slow, it's wasteful, it's ineffective, it's largely a lottery, it's easily abused, it's prone to bias, doesn't detect fraud, and is irrelevant. Apart from that, he said it's fine. In the age of the internet, we no longer need it. We should just publish everything and let the world decide on its merits. Peer review in journals only persists because of huge vested interests, and there's a dearth of hard evidence as to its real effectiveness. In fact, what evidence there is tends to point to its detriments. Peer review is poor at detecting errors. A British medical journal study containing 8 errors was sent to 300 reviewers, yet nobody spotted more than 5 of them, and the median was 2. The level of inter-reviewer agreement is no better than chance. Peer review is also anti-innovatory. There are many examples of groundbreaking work which were rejected by journals when first presented, and there's a clear biases in favour of findings that favour existing understanding. Peer review is also very costly. It's estimated at $2 billion globally. It's very slow, consumes a lot of scientists' time, and is frequently needlessly repeated. It's easily abused, for example, against competitors. It's biased against low-status institutions and biased against women. It's poor at detecting ethical breaches because experimental methods and findings are seldom described in sufficient detail and are usually taken on trust by reviewers. He went on to say that given the huge importance placed on peer review, both for grants and publications, It's extraordinary that universities have effectively outsourced the fundamental process of deciding which of their academics are competent and which are not. He closed by saying that if we insist on retaining pre-publication peer review, it should be wide open. We should publish peer review reports, editorial discussions alongside articles, and we should encourage reviewers to name themselves. In the discussion that followed, there was a great deal of support for preprint servers and the need to separate dissemination from verification. This is particularly true for the scientists in the room. As one physicist put it, archive is for dissemination and journals are for your CV. While the existing preprint servers work well in some fields, there was a general feeling they should be more widely used and that the ideal repository should have the following characteristics. Early deposit of research outputs following initial validation checks, many of which might be automatable. Open and collaborative review via commenting or posting of related articles with a view to gradually improving the original submission. Integration of social media tools and good trackback mechanisms to ensure all inputs are captured wherever they are. Credit mechanisms for reviewers, such as assigning DOIs to reviews to make them citable, use of rating points for review reports, and ORCID integration. All of these things would be formally recognised by institutions and funders as part of a researcher's overall contribution. Data validation algorithms might be developed and built into the submission process. Repositories should be ideally discipline-based and perhaps operated by international collaborations between learned societies and academies. They should be consolidated or at least compatible with existing servers and integrated into the workflows of journals as far as possible. Such a system of repositories would have the advantage of much more rapid dissemination of findings and would encourage more open and collaborative peer review. It might also help to avoid the false confidence placed in so-called version of record articles currently published in journals, as outputs would gradually evolve over several versions and gradually gain credibility and authority. The discussion also highlighted the problems of the very high rejection rates operated by some elite journals. In these circumstances, it's impossible to be truly fair, since decisions based on estimates of impact are always subjective and may be very time-specific. Current moves to wider adoption of objective peer review were therefore welcomed, as it may be easier and more reliable to judge what's correct than what's important. That's not always the case, however. An objective peer review is especially difficult to operate in mathematics, for example, where a paper may be perfectly correct but entirely trivial. There should be room for both approaches, objective and subjective peer review, as they achieve different things. A key issue identified was the lack of hard evidence as to the effectiveness of the various forms of peer review, and there was a call for more research in this area. A good deal of experimentation is already going on, of course, within journals themselves, and this was strongly encouraged. A number of journals already operate features mentioned already. Most researchers, when asked, seem to believe strongly in the principle of review by peers, but have concerns about how it's actually being done. Abandoning journal peer review completely would, of course, be a huge step, and there's understandable reluctance to take it. We need to really understand why peer review has remained for so long in its current form before we get rid of it. Given how intimately research assessment and reward mechanisms are tied up with journal publication, one of the sessions was devoted to the issues around metrics and evaluation. It's, of course, necessary to assess the quality of research, both at the level of the researcher and the institution, to inform the distribution of precious research funding and for the appointment and career development of scientists. But how should this be done? It's always tempting to rely on the apparent objectivity of numbers, and most metrics have been based on citations to journal articles in some way. Most prominent of the last few years, of course, is the journal impact factor, which has achieved a vastly inflated prominence due to an unholy alliance between researchers and publishers. Each tends to blame the other as researchers seek to publish in the most prestigious journals and publishers strive to drive up their impact factors to attract them. Universities and funders are all too often rewarding researchers for pursuing fashionable topics with the most easily measurable impacts and neglecting the less applied fields. There are no incentives of carrying out replication studies or refining techniques to engineer out sources of variability and error. There are not enough data sharing mandates or insistence on pre-registration of methods or protocols. The research system needs to address these issues and to do so through leadership and genuine cultural change. by encouraging positive behaviours in early career scientists rather than by merely imposing sanctions and box-ticking exercises. But there's much that publishers can do. Journals are still obsessed with publishing the most newsworthy or eye-catching papers and seek to drive their rejection rates ever higher to chase the numbers. As we've seen earlier, this results in a distortion of the literature away from many of the things that help to build scientific knowledge in a reliable and robust way, namely replications, reproducibility, experimental rigour, negative results. This can lead to a view of science as merely a series of exciting, game-changing discoveries. And we see this most clearly whenever a journalist interviews a scientist about a new discovery. The first question they invariably ask is, what will the application of this be? For many discoveries, it's simply the wrong question. Journals should start embracing some of these concepts in their peer review processes instead of merely trying to throw away as much as possible to beat their competitors, wasting the time of multiple sets of peer reviewers in the process. It's precisely this competition for impact that's one of the most negative effects of the commercialization of scholarly communication. The quality of a scientific article is now just code for how highly cited it's going to be. But we might do better to think of quality in terms of robustness, reproducibility, and ethical rigour, how well the science has been done and not what the result is. Of course, they're not binary alternatives, but there's a good correlation between the impact factor of a journal and its retraction rate. And we should be trying to engineer our peer review processes to do a better job of scrutinising articles for these real quality measures. After all, isn't peer review the main thing that we publishers feel we bring to the table? Journals also need to do more to mandate or at least encourage data sharing. Many allow linking their systems with the big data repositories such as Triad or Figshare. The more we can expose the data underlying journal articles, the better equipped others will be to develop and build on their results. Science needs to be far more open if we're to derive the maximum benefit from it. The scientific establishment needs to make it clear that research projects are not just a means of generating results to be kept secret long enough for the PI to squeeze the maximum number of papers out before getting scooped by a competitor. Given that science is a global and collaborative endeavour aimed at improving the lot of mankind, surely something as solipsistic as being scooped shouldn't be the issue anyway. Publishers are constantly experimenting, of course, and have provided very many valuable innovations. One of the newer article formats that has a lot of potential is the registered report. Pioneered by the journal Cortex, the concept is that the author submits for publication the experimental design, hypothesis, and statistical approach before any experiments have actually been done. The journal then decides, based on this methodological description alone, whether to accept or reject the article. The results of the study are then submitted at a later date, and provided the authors have actually done what they said they'd do, the article is published. Separating the editorial decision from the results in this way should help to reduce publication bias towards positive findings and encourage better description and closer editorial scrutiny of research methods. We've just introduced registered reports to our newest journal, Royal Society Open Science. Journal editors can be reluctant to institute tougher measures against misconduct for fear of losing authors to less stringent journals or becoming involved in lengthy disputes with researchers and institutions. But they should report cases properly into the right channels, not merely reject the article, as this prevents the author from simply taking the paper elsewhere and avoiding the consequences. Journals also need to provide better platform for debate and discussion around the articles they publish, and where those discussions are elsewhere, build in adequate trackback mechanisms to the original publication. Some journals are encouraging post-publication commenting, of course, but have so far found the take-up to be low. Initiatives such as PubPeer provide a platform for commenting away from the articles themselves. It might help to move more away from a frozen version of record approach to publishing towards a more fluid version of the article, which evolves as further research becomes available. This collaborative, iterative approach to publication is one of the reasons preprint repositories have been so popular in some fields. Some form of benchmarking or version control is clearly required, but there's a clear role for crossmark in this sort of area. So, given all this, what might we expect the future to look like? We should remember that the journal article has never been the only way that scientists have communicated. This is still the case today, and although it does hold a very dominant position, largely because of its key role in research assessment and career progression, that role depends on there being a hierarchy of journals conferring various levels of prestige on the author. But if we were able to evolve the reward system away from such a heavy reliance on publication and towards a broader form of evaluation, would the journal article still remain the key unit of communication? Machine readability and semantic enhancement would seem to be more important as the volume of output grows, and we will have to rely more and more on technology to sift the content for us and mine the literature. However, there'd presumably still be some sort of need for a human readable layer, presumably in addition to all the code in the shared data sets. Articles might become more modular as more are published under open reuse licenses, and they may become fragmented into discrete information chunks for different purposes according to the user's needs. It seems inevitable that the journal article must evolve, as it no longer adequately reflects the complexity of modern digital science. Despite the enormous impact of the web, the format of the journal article has remained essentially the same as it was in the 19th century. We can't express entire methods and experiments succinctly merely by adding data sets to a written text. We must learn to separate content from display and use more dynamic tools such as wikis to make the journal article more diffuse and to allow it to take more different forms according to the requirements of the user. Do we still really need all those pages of carefully crafted and stylized prose? Are we trying too hard to make journal articles into narrative stories, where there may in fact not be a story, or at least not yet? We should also remember that scientific communication is not only for scientific peers, it's for the wider community too. And this is especially true as science is coming under threat from anti-science forces. Climate change and genetically modified crops are obviously examples of where powerful but ill-informed lobby groups are distorting the public's understanding of the science. We should be citing claims and data as well as articles to provide a better linked knowledge network. Natural language processing is very good at claim detection and identification of trends in data using metadata. But we're still in the early days of text mining, and regrettably few publishers are taking a positive attitude towards it, seeing it instead as just another way of generating revenue. The possibilities of a genuinely linked web of data are enormous. We'll have the ability to check and verify facts in real time against other data sets that exist elsewhere. An example of this is the system in use during the broadcast speeches of US politicians. But it's perhaps the inherently conservative habits of most scientists that lead to the retention of the journal article and the seemingly unshakable faith in traditional peer review, rather than fully realizing the benefits of technology. This is why the archive preprint service seems to be able to coexist with journals, because most physicists want a formal publication after the less formal exchanges that take place on archive. The reward system we have still requires this, and until we can fix that system, and let's face it, publishers have very little to do with that, the article will still surely remain centrally important. Publishers have proved time and time again that they're able and prepared to innovate and keep themselves at the center of the story. Of course, many people have argued that the supplier monopoly we've had up to now has made the market dysfunctional, and there's no doubt that some publishers have exploited this. There's been much discussion in academic circles of the profits made by scientific publishers and whether they're acceptable. However, the advent of technology and the principles of open access can and will change all this as we're moving from a reader to an author market. Provided that publishers work with funders to develop an efficient and transparent system and deliver the services that scientists require in an effective way, profit should be entirely acceptable and indeed helps to fund innovation. So, to summarize, there are clearly many problems with the system by which science is communicated at the moment. Many of them are outside the direct control of publishers, and will need a concerted effort by the many other players in the system, primarily funders and research institutions, to fix them. Most notable is the damage caused by the high-impact publish or perish culture, which provides perverse incentives through excessive focus on an individual's journal articles. This gives rise to publication bias, distorted priorities, and even research misconduct. we should seek to move to a much broader evaluation of a researcher's expertise and contribution. But there are many useful things that publishers can do to improve matters and help evolve the present system into one that serves science rather better. Many publishers are, of course, already well underway with many initiatives in this regard. At the Royal Society, we've identified a number of ideas as a result of our meeting that we'll be putting into practice, some of which we've already started with. So here's my current shopping list. We've made ORCID IDs mandatory for contributing authors at the point of submission and already display ORCIDs in our journal headers. We've had a very positive experience with open peer review, and we'll be looking at extending that approach to our other journals. We've introduced the registered reports article format with the aim of tackling publication bias and irreproducibility. Objective peer review, pioneered of course by PLOS ONE, is working well in our newest journal, and we're considering applying that more widely too. We'll be applying more open licenses to our peer review reports to make them more portable and allow reviewers to cite them. We're piloting the peer review reward system, Publons, on our biggest journal. We've signed up all our journals to the top guidelines to support transparency, reliability, and reproducibility. We now publish the citation distributions of all our journals on our website to highlight the shortcomings of the impact factor as a metric. We'll be encouraging all our authors to deposit early versions of their manuscripts in subject repositories such as Archive and bioRxiv, and building reciprocal links to them wherever possible. And finally, we require all our authors to share their data sets in recognized repositories, provide links to them, and we'll pay any charges that are incurred on their behalf. Thank you for your attention.
So, ladies and gentlemen, do we have questions for Stuart? You obviously stunned them with the results of your conference. Yes, we have one at the back, yes. Can you remember to say who you are and where you're from, please?
Yeah, sorry, I was waiting. Hi. Hi, I'm Liz Allen. I'm currently at F1000. Until recently, I was at the Wellcome Trust, so I've got a bit of a funder perspective and a publisher perspective. I'm interested, Richard, it was a really interesting talk because of all the kind of interest that I've got. I'm just interested in how much your grant, because you fund grants as well as kind of publishing, how much peer review is considered at the grant level as well, and whether you're looking at peer review processes there, because it seems to me, with both hats on, that what publishers deal with is kind of the output of what grants were selected in the first place, and I think to consider peer review at the publishing level, you also need to think about it at the grant level.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously the peer review for the grants is not directly under my control, but actually awarding grants is the biggest thing we do in terms of finance. I mean, we hand out about 50 or so million pounds a year in terms of grants. So yes, the peer review process is crucial. So I'm making sure that I'm keeping my colleagues in the grants team very up to date with what's happening in the journal world, because I think peer review and discussions around peer review are advancing much more quickly in that area than actually in the grants area. So yeah, I think it's obviously very important, yes.
Do we have another question? No. Oh, we do. We just have one right at the back there. Carve.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Carve from River Valley Technologies. I think there's a problem that the primary form or the primary credit that a researcher gets, it's still the publication, the narrative. I'm very much in favor of narrative because a non-specialist wants to actually read about it. However much data you have, you really want to read and understand it. As you say, a beautifully formed typeset PDF is actually very nice to read. But the problem is that is the only thing that a researcher gets credit for. So the research is not moving fast enough. What I'm trying to say is that that narrative should not be the primary reporting of research, but it should be further down the line. So we can have both. So science can move fast, and you have good narrative, so we can read and see what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think the previous speaker to me made this point a lot more effectively than I did. I think the narrative does have a value, but it's not very scalable. And as we do more and more science, I think that's a bit of a luxury we may not be able to afford for much longer. But in terms of the assessment of researchers, I think it's essential that we move away from purely looking at the publication output of researchers and assess them more broadly. I mean, if you look at the NIH BioSketch, that's quite an interesting a step towards this. But, you know, researchers make a contribution in lots of different ways, not just their publications. You know, we ought to be evaluating them on, you know, how good a scientist they are, how many data sets they've shared, how many students they've mentored, how many plenary lectures they've given, how many cell lines they've produced or software they've written. You know, there's a whole pile of things that we should be assessing, not simply obsessing about their journal, you know, record. And until we fix that, we're not going to fix the impact factor and all the ills that stem from that. So, you know, there's a lot of changing that needs to be done, and actually most of it's not from publishers. Publishers are doing their best, I think. Anyway.
Okay, I'm afraid if we're to keep to time, we have to move on. So thank you very much to Stuart.